Now, so it's the time for the room to express any questions or comments to our panelists. So we have questions, so that's good. So we'll use the microphone because the session is being recorded.
Sure, okay. I thought this was a fantastic discussion. I was particularly pleased with the attempt to address the issue of the public and framing the problem. I think that's essential, but I think in some respects maybe that's where sometimes debates like this completely miss the boat. Particularly if what we've not addressed, and I apologize because maybe Yves Gingras raised this on the first day, I wouldn't doubt, but I wasn't here. So the ideology where a marketplace actually decides then the scientific research that gets done sometimes is narrowly oriented toward the economy or the investment, if you can put it that way, certainly to the practical. I'm wondering whether or not, if anybody would like to comment on whether a debate on public policy is really fruitful without comprehending the orientation or the ideology of what public, or more likely, more particularly, public interest really does mean. So we have examples of disputes over the effects of, say, nanotechnology, global warming, whatever, that really has to confront market-driven science. Scott raised a very interesting example of Jefferson, the great Enlightenment figure, raising the problem of the informed public, but I would think one might address that even more broadly. That is, defining or informing what a public interest really is.
Anyone would care to?
I'll try that one. You know, a lot of people are afraid of science. And that's why they didn't go in science when they were young, when they were teenagers or when they were adults. They were just afraid of science. And that's why also many elementary teachers don't teach science, because they are afraid of science. That's why they went into elementary education. And unfortunately, there are many journalists that are the same. And who reads newspaper? It's the public. Who reads news? It's the public. And unfortunately, the journalists don't understand the science very often. And I'll share something that I've heard about 3 years ago when the new Science Media Center was created here for Canada. And it was following the establishment of a Science Media Center that was established in England because there were problems with respect to the public not understanding science. What happened is that the journalist didn't understand what was genetically modified food. So there were those images, front page of newspaper with literally Franken food, if you want, and things that, you know, just to frighten people. Same thing happened with BSE. Suddenly, there were a lot of people not eating beef because they were just afraid. And it even had repercussions here in Canada. When in fact, yes, BSE is very serious, but guess what? The likelihood of having one animal affected by BSE was relatively low, in fact, very low, both in UK and also in Canada. My point with respect to your point is that very often, first people talk about things that they don't know, and they think they know, so they begin to make you believe certain things. And in fact, they really don't know, but that sells. And nobody talked about the role of media here today. And for me, that's a critical element when we begin to talk about science. Just looked, by curiosity, those of you that still buy newspaper, because I know quite a few go web now, but if you just buy a couple of newspaper for a week, just calculate the number of articles related to science compare to other types of articles, and you'll see that, in fact, we're not helping ourselves. So I just want to make another link to something that I've heard, that there was a dissension with respect to citizen science. Is it good? Is it not good? I think, personally, if we do not do citizen science, we're making a mistake, because often it is a way to help people to understand science and to begin to be curious, to take Pat's comment from the beginning, and to want to know more about something. And so that's why there are roles of people. I'm going back to my notions of interpreters that I was mentioning earlier. And so you need to have people that help other people to understand science.
I think those are important points, but I think that on the BSE question, I think the reason why people talked about things they didn't know was because previously with mad cow disease, or not mad cow disease, with hoof and mouth disease, scientists didn't talk about things they did know. And that was the problem in the UK. And so there was a distrust of the scientific community for having been quiet. And the repercussions of that are being paid for now. So I wouldn't blame citizens for that. I would say that was... okay.
No, sorry. I said it was the media, because the media didn't know, and because, in fact, they were not in contact with the scientists. That's why the Science Media Center was created, to ensure that there were a list of scientists that could explain, in fact, what was happening. Go ahead.
Perhaps I can, and this is something about which I know almost nothing, but when we talk about the public interest, I'm curious that we use the definite article, because it seems to me that actually if we talk about the interests of the public, we would be or publics, we would be further ahead. So of course those interests are related to values. So when I think of science in the public interest, I think of science, whether it's prosecuted by academic scientists, whether it's prosecuted by industry, whether it's prosecuted by the government, it's science that relates to the sustaining of those interests of the public which relate to values. So economic opportunities are certainly things that people value. Cultural values, environmental, the environment, human health. To me, that's really what science in the interests of the public is. That speaks to the plurality of values. And the issue about whether only some of those values can be the target of government research or academic research or business research, I could imagine that you could have privatized research that deals with any of those sets of values. I don't see that there's anything intrinsic about those sets of values or interests that means you got to do it on the public dime versus on the corporate dime. Perhaps it's just ignorance on my part, but I don't actually see it.
Just to continue on these issues, when we say the public don't know, I remember how many articles I've seen about GMOs, and the public don't know how to produce GMOs, and because they don't know this technical fact, so they don't know GMOs at all. But I would like to know who knows in this room that who control the seeds in the world right now? How many firms control the seeds market? Right now, it was in 96, 3 firms were controlling 22%. Right now, it's 3 firms who are controlling 50% of the seeds. 54. Yes, it's even worse. And in fact, the people knows pretty well that first of all the seeds, the GMOs right now that we have, it's 4 products, essentially maize and soja, that there's one threat, then there's one function, it's pesticide pump. And this pesticide pump, it's essentially Roundup. And Roundup is known right now. There's at least 30 different studies on that. It's now known as an endocrine disruptor. So what are we doing in this country and in the United States and everywhere with this large distribution of an endocrine disruptor when we know how much endocrine disruptors are involved in the increase of cancer, for example, to name just this one. So it's one example of, people are realizing the concentration of power around these things. They are realizing a lot of things, but the question that we're asking to them is, do you know this technical thing? No, they don't used to. But they understand quite well their interest and who's the interest related to this product or this orientation or this misinformation of the public. And I think it's very important to separate those things. And I'm not saying that there's no work of dissemination of information and sharing of information and museums, and but I'm saying that right now there's a lot of people who are knowing really more what's going on than we are thinking that they are knowing.
There are 4 more questions in the room, so what I suggest, because we have limited time, we'll take 2 questions. We'll ask you to answer either one of the 2 questions, and then we'll proceed with the next question. So question is from the far back.
Yes, thank you. This is a question coming from a member of the live stream audience who is a graduate student at the Faculty of Education in Marwa. The question is, does the panel think teachers have a role in popularizing science? And as a sub-question, why don't scientists go to schools and cooperate with teachers to communicate the science to the students and improve science literacy?
Thank you. So you've noted the question, and then I'll move on to our next question.
I'm deeply concerned with the governance issue, particularly when we're talking about things like solar radiation management and synthetic biofuels, as if these are solutions, when they may be potential solutions from a scientific perspective, but in terms of how they might be appropriated politically or what their broad impact might be, either of these could be greater disasters in the problems they're meant to solve. And I wondered if we could hear a little bit more in terms of how to move forward on that governance concern.
Thank you. Which one of our panelists would like to start?
Okay, I will go with the first one, the first question. I think the first question was, is there a role for teachers to teach science, and why scientists don't go in school? First, yes, there's an absolute role for teachers to teach science, even though they are not into the science class. Because some of you talked about the process of science. In fact, when you buy a car, when you buy a new iPhone, an iPad, you use the process of science in order to decide which of the iPhone or the iPad or the car that you will buy. So it is essential because it helps people to have critical thinking and to be able to question what there is and be curious also. There are scientists in schools. In fact, there are probably scientists from Ottawa universities that go in school. There are partnerships. There are scientists that go in museums also. There are scientists like partners in research that do it either virtually or in person. So, in fact, there are a number of scientists that do that and love to do this. And the question is that are teachers taking advantage of it as often as they should? And especially if they are afraid of science, there are so many ways that they can teach and receive help to teach science. So,
Well, on the It's on? Is it on? Yes. On the issue of solar radiation management and geoengineering, the struggle now, frankly, is to have it debated in the United Nations, and there is some appetite for that among governments. I hope it will be debated in the next few months. There are discussions going on in a few locations already, not at the level of the General Assembly, but at the level of international negotiations, so that next June in Montreal, June 24 to 27, there'll be a conference, which is the scientific subcommittee of the Biodiversity Convention. We'll be looking at geoengineering, and especially at solar radiation management. And that's a meeting of scientists from 193 countries. So it'll be there for debate. There is a moratorium now in the United Nations against geoengineering, but a moratorium is a very weak form of law. And so it really needs to be more into the General Assembly. There is a treaty that was adopted in 1978 by governments, way, way back, which was called an Environmental Modification Treaty, in which governments, including Canada and the United States, most major governments signed the treaty. It's legally binding, which committed them to not doing geoengineering, basically. But it's been ignored. And so the issue is to get that back on the table and to have the discussion. Again, the issue is really, first of all, to discuss governance. Secondly, it's the governments then and their societies can decide what they want to do about it. But at least it has to be out on the table. Our alarm is that we are seeing China talking with the United States, talking with Russia, especially those countries, about how they could do it themselves without discussing it with the rest of the world.
And I would like to add that when we are speaking about governance, I think we really have to look to the economic interest related to that. In nanotechnology, for example, at least half of the money was used to develop nanotechnology is public funds. And we have to understand that, for example, the lack of control and the lack of rules around not only GMOs, but also pharmacultures in North America, and also nanotechnology now. It's related to some postulates, which are not scientific, which are economic. It's GRAS, generally recognized as safe at the first instance, and after that, the principle of equivalence. I cannot understand how much is so different that it has to be patent, but not enough different to be the object of real analysis and assessment.
You have the last one.
No, I don't know.
Okay, I will take a question here, but before I pass the microphone, there's a lot of young people that are probably less than my age, and in the room that are students themselves. And then I'd like to hear from one of you at least. What does this all say to you? You've heard a lot about even questioning on the validity of science teaching, and all of these issues and problems in science in general. Is this something that scares you, or is it something that excites you to be engaged in? So I'd like to come back to either one of you so that you get an impression on that, but I'll go to this question first.
Yeah, it does scares me quite a lot, and so let me try to do this in some ways. So, so my concern is that perhaps we're setting up ourselves to what might be an impossible task. So on the one hand, we have this sort of hope that if only we could sort of make this the current institutionalization of science more transparent, if only science were, honest, and our public was better informed and sophisticated in terms of understanding the sort of the methodological assumptions that often go in, the values that go in directly and indirectly. If we had better mechanisms in place for disclosing important aspects of the scientific findings and that sort of thing, we'd have a sort of a better way of making this interplay. But what I'm concerned with, and I think this. It didn't really come up in the symposium. So that perhaps what we're dealing with is this sort of inherent limitation of the science per se. So the problem is with science, of the way of communicating what scientific findings, results really are. it's easier if I contextualize this. Here's a domain that I'm familiar with. I mean, take the domain of clinical trials. Okay, so here, going along with what Scott was saying, which sort of resonated with me, right? I mean, it's all music to my ears. Communicating is crucial, the importance of evidence, and sort of, revealing out the sort of the values, right? They're embedded there. So here you have a group of experts who are making a decision about the best ways of sort of designing a study for finding whether a drug does what it's supposed to do and it's safe in the ways that we hope that it is. And there's a certain strategy for monitoring it and making decisions. Closed rooms about, is this enough evidence? Is not enough evidence? Does the current efficacy outweigh the possible long-term side effects of these drugs? I mean, these are value judgments made behind closed doors. But at the end of the day, I mean, there's a sort of a science that, I mean, there are sciences in science, but in this particular context, I mean, this is a science on the clock. People have to make a decision. We're running out of time, right? We are constrained by financial resources, so, well, make a decision. But the way we express these scientific results, right, the evidence for the drug, the way that are published, these values are lost. How could you possibly express this sort of judgment call? So if that is a limitation of science per se, so perhaps isn't this maybe an invitation for maybe rethinking about a different form of science or something like that?
So before I ask our panelists to do a closing statement, because unfortunately the time is over, I'm just asking anybody else wants to.
This may go a little bit along with what you were saying, but I'm taking the opposite view. And a few of us were talking about this yesterday, and basically, I feel that I'm a PhD student, and many of the scientists that I see that are my supervisors or colleagues, we have a lot on our plates. There's a lot going on in your day-to-day just to get your research ready to publish, and the research cycle in itself is often a full load, and that's at a PhD level, and I'm only working on one project. I can't imagine what a research scientist, how his day looks or her day looks, where you're just flooded with things to do. And for us to then go and become experts of policy and learn a different language is sometimes a tall task, I think. Because some of my research sort of is in the climate science realm, I've often been asked, well, what does it mean to policy? And I can't answer that question. I mean, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, trying to look at freshwater policy and trying to see how my little algal biomonitoring research could fit into that. But in a big policy sense, sometimes it's really difficult. And I guess my question is the onus just on scientists, or is it also on policymakers to form a bridge, a toolkit to talk to each other? We're operating in silos, and one says, well, I don't understand you, and the other, I'm sure, doesn't understand them. So it can't just be one person's problem. It has to be both, I think.
Our collective problem. I'll take a last comment here, and then we'll close.
Thank you. I feel that the main problem is that we compartmentalize subjects, and when we say that it's science, it has to be maths or physics or chemistry. I could be teaching civics or history, and I could be teaching science in a scientific way. I could be inculcating creativity. I could be encouraging questioning. I could follow all the methods of science. So, and that's the reason in society I've been teaching in India for 20 years, and here too I've seen that there is a prestige about certain subjects, and there is a kind of feeling, oh, you're taking this, where would this road lead to? You're not taken the right subject. So I thought it was different here, but it's the same thing. So it's because we think that science rests only in physics or chemistry. So it could be, I could be teaching English, and I could be a science teacher. I could teach it in a scientific way. So I think if we want that a holistic approach, it's very important that society and science. I can see science in everything, whether it could be my belief, it could be my religion, it could be a superstition or my way of living, praying, exercise, eating. It's everywhere. Science is everywhere. So I see it that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's take a last one.
So I know there was a question about what are the students thinking, what are the new up-and-coming scientists thinking. I'm a fourth-year student at Ottawa U. I've actually taken a class with Dr. Findlay, and I'm taking a class right now designed by Dr. Findlay. And I can say that all of this seems very exciting. It's a whole new discipline, I think, within science that kind of allows you to be creative. In my first and second year in science, learning at Ottawa U, I found the amount of data you were receiving was overwhelming, and the way the curriculum was set up was just, it almost crushed my interest in science and my amazement in science and my wonder in science. And I think the great thing about getting the ball rolling on science communication is it opens up a new door for kids who are interested in science but don't want to actually study pure science. They want to study how can we make science cooler? How can we make it cool? How can we make it creative? How can we show the wonder we feel in science to the world? And I think that this is a really amazing kind of discussion panel. It gets people thinking about science as a part of your life and how you can share it with others.
Thank you so much. Now, closing statement. I suggest that we go reverse order of. So perhaps, Mme. Vandelac, you could start.
C'est gentil. I just would like to come back to the comment which was done, which seems to be quite interesting. And, you know, I think one of the problems is the kind of glass that we wear. In economy, for example, we still have glasses looking to the economy with PNB. Oh, I'm sorry. So I was speaking about glasses that we wear, and in fact, we don't have the good glasses. You know, it's impossible in an economy on Earth where we have limits to have this impression and this dream that there's no limits for the development. And PNB, it's no more the right lens that we have to use. I think it's the same thing in medicine. For example, we were speaking about evidence, but in some sectors, it's not so simple. For example, endocrine disruptor, which is related to our future, because we know, for example, that spermatogenèse has a chuté de moitié. The low sperm count is cut by half at least. And we know all the effects on cancer and on a lot of different things. But it's not the poison which make, as we know usually in... je peux pas continuer en français un peu? Ah, juste 2 minutes, parce que vraiment...
Non, pas 2 minutes.
Non, une seconde. On sait maintenant que sur le dossier des perturbateurs endocriniens, c'est la fenêtre d'exposition qui compte. Ce n'est pas nécessairement le fait d'être hautement contaminé. On sait même qu'au niveau des données statistiques, que c'est complètement erratique, que des doses très très faibles, de quelques parties par trillion, peuvent avoir un impact au niveau du développement embryonnaire. Or, les lunettes habituelles qu'on a en médecine ne permettent pas de voir ça. De la même façon, au Canada, on a énormément de gens qui souffrent de problèmes d'hypersensibilité chronique. Or, il y a quelques médecins de l'Association des médecins de famille en Ontario qui travaillent là-dessus. Mais au Québec, impossible. Les gens sont malades, font en moyenne 28 visites de médecins avant d'avoir un diagnostic parce qu'ils ne connaissent pas ce type de problèmes-là qui sont liés à ce qu'on appelle chemical sensitivity, des problèmes d'hypersensibilité chimique, mais c'est un ensemble de, je dirais, de problèmes de santé aux causes multiples. Et il n'y a même pas moyen de faire des projets de recherche là-dessus. Parce que du côté des IRSC, on vous dit « Ah, ben oui, mais ça n'existe pas vraiment encore. Le Collège des médecins, vous allez voir le ministère, le Collège des médecins n'a pas décrété que ça existait, donc vous ne pouvez pas faire de recherche là-dessus. » Du côté des organismes en sciences humaines, ils disent « Ben non, surtout pas, on n'a tellement pas d'argent, on ne va pas faire de recherche sur des questions de santé, c'est trop santé. » Et si, par malheur, vous êtes en sciences humaines et que vous travaillez avec des équipes de médecins, mais que vous lidez la recherche, alors là, c'est un crime de lèse-majesté. Bref, puis si vous le faites avec des citoyens, en plus, qui sont les premiers concernés, qui ont été les alerteurs sur ce dossier-là, ah ben là, on vous dit qu'il faut faire une recherche coopérative, collaborative, qu'il faut faire de la co-construction des savoirs, mais on va vous mettre tous les bâtons dans les roues. Donc, il y a vraiment des problèmes de lunettes. Et ces problèmes de lunettes, ils sont très largement partagés au niveau des organismes subventionnaires. Il n'y a presque pas de lieu pour faire de la recherche intersectorielle véritablement, sans instrumentaliser une discipline par un autre. Et il est, à mon avis, absolument impossible que, par exemple, au Canada, j'avais beaucoup insisté au Québec pour que ça se fasse, et ils ont ouvert un tout petit créneau, minuscule, mais quand même, ça a le bonheur d'exister, pour des recherches novatrices, pour des recherches qui ne seraient pas subventionnées ailleurs, mais qui portent sur des questions qui sont socialement importantes, qui peuvent conduire à autre chose, et même les modes de sélection sont différents pour ces types de projets. Si tous les organismes subventionnaires laissaient un peu d'air, 1-2% du budget de recherche pour de la véritable innovation en recherche et pour favoriser l'interdisciplinarité et l'intersectorialité, je pense que ce serait déjà voilà, des perspectives intéressantes. I'm sorry for the anglophones. I will talk to you with a glass of wine. It will be easier. Thank you.
I agree with absolutely everything you said, though I didn't fully understand it. But I'm sure I do agree. I'm not sure I'm not going to try to answer all the comments and questions. There are more comments than questions, and that's all really valid. But I would say that in terms of whose responsibilities lie where, no one gets a free ride. And it's clear that the scientific community cannot close its eyes to what's happening around it, and doesn't want to, I'm sure. It's also true that the policymakers had better open up their eyes to the reality of what's around them, because they're not paying attention. They're using science as an excuse not to do things constantly. It's a constant refrain that there's a technological fix for literally everything. When you look at what came out of the Rio Plus 20 conference last year in Rio de Janeiro, it's a hopelessly sad document. And in every paragraph, it says something about new technologies will take care of this. Just constantly. And that you shouldn't let them get away with stuff like that. And then I think it's also true that the public has got to have the chance to learn and understand more about science and policy making. But I do agree that and I think one thing you said earlier was that the public does kind of get ownership and control. It does kind of get the ability to follow the money and who's making the decisions. And I think that's one thing that the scientific community hasn't been perhaps as open about as it should be. To give it, I mean, we're seeing a remarkable decline in, for example, private sector research. We're seeing a decline in the number of startup companies in North America and in Europe. We're seeing a decline in the number of employees in those startup companies. We're seeing a decline in venture capital investment in those companies. So in the private sector, we're not getting much anymore from that. What we're getting is such a level of corporate concentration that the need to innovate is lower than it's been in about a century. They don't need to innovate now. You have such a concentration of power in the hands of so few companies. They trade the patents with each other, so there's no need. I mean, you don't do private research, you do public relations about the private research. That's all you have to do. And to give an example in terms of agriculture, which is an area that I began my work with, but we're in many other areas now, if you look at, it's not just the 3 companies that control 54% of the seeds, it is just 6 companies globally control 75% of all private sector research in agricultural inputs. 6 companies. And they have all cross-licensed each other. So you will not get innovation from that group. They have no need to innovate. So if we're looking to, or hoping that, the private sector will get us through all of this. No, it won't. The concentration isn't there. If you go back to the Royal Commission on Corporate Concentration, back in the 1970s, they said that, and no one's ever denied this, it's been around the world, if you get more than a 4-company concentration that has more than 50% of the market, you see a rapid decline in the innovation level. Well, that's in every sector, of whether we're talking about pharmaceuticals or we're talking about farms. That's what we're faced with. So as scientists, don't get trapped into that environment, and at least be aware of the fact that ownership and control is central to what science you're going to be allowed to do.
Thank you.
Is it my turn? Yep. Yes. All right, you're last. I would just make 2 comments. The first one is that this question, the comment that was raised that science and the scientific method is everywhere, it's absolutely true. In fact, Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, 150 years ago, said that science is nothing more than the normal working of the human mind. And I think that that's actually reassuring, because it means that in principle, it shouldn't be that difficult to sell science to the public because they all do it. I guess the other point that I would make is, and I guess maybe this is a message of hope, is that I don't know whether people know Stuart Kauffman, a very famous theoretical biophysicist, and in 1992 he wrote a book called At Home in the Universe. And the thesis of his book, which he put forward for both theoretical and empirical evidence, was that the most rapid evolution of complex systems occurs at the edge of chaos. And I guess maybe, this is something I know nothing about, but I guess from the comments that I've heard about technology governance, we're sitting at the edge of chaos, so maybe if Dr. Kauffman is right, we can expect rapid evolution.
Thank you.
I want to reassure you, because you said I think you were not frightened, it's not the word you use, but you felt that it was like a bit too much. If you were to go in science, I think the contrary. I think it's marvelous, because more it is complex, more it will force people to work together. Because science, at the end of the day, is multidisciplinary. It's not an individual act. And so my wish is that people will stop working alone and thinking they have the solutions, because in fact, if they talk more to people, they will see that science is everywhere, and in fact, other people can help them to see something that they had not seen. And I guess I'll finish by a story. At the college, we do a lot of applied research, and thanks to the funding from INSERC. And it's a true story, what I will tell you. There was as you know, concussion are quite dangerous when you hurt yourself if you're playing hockey or things like that. And there was this person from Ottawa that had this idea that maybe if we put a sensor in the helmet of a person that has a concussion, maybe we could see how dramatic or how dangerous has been the concussion. And what happened is that someone heard about they approached Algonquin College, and finally they did a prototype and they worked on it, they tested. And people heard about it, and there was this person on TV that did not a show, but a clip, if you want, on this invention. And it was done by Impact, if you wonder what was the sensor. And Impact Incorporated. And what happened is that when the person, the journalist, did the clip, he was talking about this gizmo, if you want, this sensor that was inside the helmet. And he said, you know, isn't it marvelous? Because one day we'll be able to see what happened on the concussion on this iPhone. then the two guys that work on this sensor, looked at each other and they thought, oh my God, we never thought about that. So what happened, and that's a true story, what happened, they had their sensor, it had worked and all that, but then they decided to build an app to go on an iPhone so that it could be used by a coach who would have the sensor in each of the helmet of his team, and he could see who was green light with respect to the concussion, who was yellow light, and who was red light. So, as you can see, that's my conclusion, that science basically is everybody. Everybody can give someone an idea, and after the science process starts. But you need to have a spark at one point and be able to seize the opportunity and to seize how it can make a difference in the life of people, because now this invention exists. The app exists, and now they are working on phase 2, but unfortunately, they couldn't tell me what it was yet.
Et peut-être qu'on pourrait changer les règles du jeu.
Je voudrais que vous vous joigniez à moi pour remercier notre panel. I'd like you to join me in thanking this extraordinary panel for